Hello everyone, welcome to Imprint IAS. I'm Varun Khuller, and as a part of Imprint Knowledge Solutions, we are looking at India after independence, and now we are looking at the chapter number 4, that is evolution of the constitution and its main provision. Now, before we start, what are the major points are you going to learn from this chapter? So basically, this chapter will decide and will tell you about the main provisions, yes, but you will get to know that why was 26th January chosen, right? Instead of 26th November as the day of adoption of the Constitution of India. Then why parliamentary democracy was chosen, that's also a part of this chapter. Then when was the Constitution first demanded by Indians, that's also mentioned in this chapter. And then we'll talk about the process of how step by step Indian nationalists were looking for constitutional amendments. We'll talk about the Government of India Act in 1909, 1919, 1935, and so on. And finally, we'll talk about fundamental rights, TPSPs. We'll talk about the basic structure of the constitution and so on. Right. So let's start. Right. So the chapter is evolution of the constitution and its main provisions. Right. And as you all know, the Constitution of India came into force on 26th January 1950. Now that's very strange. As you remember, if you have seen the preamble, you will see that it was adopted on 26th of November. So what was the reason? The reason in very simple terms was, since on 26th January 1930, it was a day on which thousands of people in villages and mohallas and towns and small and big groups, they used to basically take part in an independence pledge. And they used to commit themselves to the complete independence of India from British rule. And that was the idea. Now, the next question would be, why did we choose a parliamentary democracy? Right? The reason being, the idea of parliamentary democracy, right, was introduced into the Indian political consciousness, by the inclusion of the term that is the Congress. And the Congress was basically taken from the word, the lower house of the USA, right? And that then what happened was, in actual functioning also, the Congress from 1920 became on the elective principle. What was that? That all office bearers were chosen through elections, be it was the All India Congress or the secretary of the village level Congress committee. They were all elected. Now, once they were all elected, it typically became that the Congress president was the counterpart of the prime minister, right? And that was the working committee of the Congress was equivalent to the cabinet. Right. So as we were saying, that the office bearers of the congressmen were seen to be, MPs, MLAs, and in case you were in the working committee, you were seen as equivalent of the cabinet. So when the Constitution of India was adopted in 1950, we adopted a parliamentary form of government and led by a cabinet, right? And with a cabinet and led by the prime minister. It was not as if it's commonly supposed that we are emulating the British Parliament. If we were just formalizing practices which we were already familiar with. And that was the reason that we chose parliamentary democracy. Even more than the form, it was a spirit of democracy that was inculcated by the people, by the national movement, and that was being formalized. Okay, now how do you say that? Now, the first was obviously the adult franchise. Okay, so there were obviously a couple of things that has still to be debated, whether women should be given the right to vote, because nowhere else in the world women were given the right to vote along with men, right? So now the question would be that in 1930 itself, during the civil disobedience movement, during the non-cooperation movement, Gandhi had entrusted crucial parts of the movement to them. So how can now we go back on that trust, right? Okay. On the other hand, should we have property and income qualification which have existed in even the 1945 elections? Okay. In 1935 elections, only 15% of the population voted. Before that, in after the 1919 amendments, only 3% of the elections voted. People voted. That is. Now, could a property or income qualification coexist with the concept of Daridra Narayan and Antodaya, which is the upliftment of the poor, right? The idea being, could illiterate and education qualification be smuggled into the constitution once Gandhi ji had based his entire struggle on the dumb millions? Now, this is being done today, by various governments that they, for example, in Haryana and Rajasthan, we are smuggling literacy or educational qualifications into the constitution, right? Especially in the case of the Panchayati Raj. Then the next question comes on the freedom of press. Now, the struggle of freedom of press under British rule was vigorously fought by many leaders. What are those? Who are those? So Lokmanya Tilak was the most famous one of them. He was sent to Mandalay for years just because of that. Then Amitabh Bazar Patrika, Anand Bazar Patrika, the Tribune, the Hindu, the Hindustan Times, all of them functioned as unpaid organs of the national movement, right? And that is the reason journalism, they're so much, they're so close. Most journalists are very, very close to a politician. But this history of freedom of expression ensured that it became a fundamental right in the Constitution. That is the reason we have Article 19 of the Constitution, right? Freedom of speech of expression. Then let's talk about the next part of this. We'll now talk about the fact how the Constitution was first demanded. Okay, so we have the first demand is a lot later, right? That was a Home Rule Bill in 1895, and it was anonymous, but it would have said to have been published and inspired by Lokmanya Tilak. Okay, but even before that, let's try to understand about the freedom. So, did the Britishers free India, or did we take freedom from them? That is the basic question I'd like to talk about in the coming few minutes. So, what Gandhi says in 1922, he says that Swaraj will not be a gift of the British Parliament. It will be a declaration of India's full expression. That it will be expressed through an act of Parliament is true, but it is merely a courteous ratification of the declared wish of the people of India, even as it was the case of the Union of South Africa. Right? The British Parliament, when the settlement comes, will ratify the wishes of the people of India as expressed not through the bureaucracy, but through her freely chosen representative. Gandhi says that Swaraj can never be a gift from one nation to another. It is a treasure to be purchased with a nation's best blood. It will cease to be a gift when we have paid dearly for it. So the idea became that, whatever the Britishers gave us, it was not that they gave us, we took it from them. Right? Britishers never wanted to leave India because, India was always a crown jewel. Okay. So this statement made, it clear that Britishers did not introduce any constitutional reform or organs on their own initiative, but always in belated and grudging response to the sustained national pressure, be it in 1861, in 1892, 1909, or 1919, or 1935. It was snatched, it was through pressure, not through anything else. Okay, you can take the example of the elective principle introduced by the British in the Indian Councils Act of 1892, and the nationalist demand was far exceeding what was there. Okay, and I've already talked about the Constitution of India Bill that was in 1895, or the Home Rule Bill, whose authorship is not conclusive evidence, but which Annie Besant thought was probably issued under Lokmanya Gandhar Tilak inspirations. And in this bill, we had notions of basic human rights such as freedom of speech, of expression, equality before law, right to inviolability of one's home. And this was very important because the British used to just barge in, right? And basically take away any property. So therefore, they actually had the right to property for all citizens of India. There are reasons for all these things. Freedom of speech, of expression, because of the Vernacular Press Act, that you can't write, you can't speak what you think. It will be put under sedition charges. Equality before law, the Ilbert Bill, that Indian judge cannot even try a European. Forget about having equality with them. Right to inviolability of one's home, that the Britisher, the police used to just barge in your home and take away anything, right, without a warrant, right? So right to property again was big as a result of that. Okay, so when the Government of India Act was enacted, it also obviously in 1935 they basically failed to satisfy our demands. So, but when finally India was made free, the Indian leaders felt no necessity to abandon the constitutional legacy of pre-independence, right? A period at the time of the writing of the Constitution, and they didn't feel that they were needed to start on a clean slate. Why? Because of a simple reason. They felt it was their legacy. They had fought hard for the constitutional, the Government of India Acts that happened either in 1919 or in 1935, and they made sacrifice for them. It was not given to them, right? And therefore, the Constitution could freely borrow from the Government of India Act of 1935 because those who drafted the Constitution had no need to prove their independent credentials. They believed that advantage of familiarity of that which exists with existing institutions should not be rejected. They also felt that we should reject what was unsuitable in the old and add what was new. but they did not hesitate to retain what was of value. And that was the reason that India is a parliamentary democracy, because we were already familiar with that institution. They felt we can add new things to make our constitution better, and we'll talk about the various areas in which we have added from various parts. Okay, but the idea being that we didn't care about the fact what will people say about us. Okay, right? Log kya kahenge? At least the Constituent Assembly makers didn't think about that. They thought about what the vision of India should be, and they decided upon that. Then let's talk about the constituent development. The development of the constitution. How did it come across? So, beginning in the 1880s, and the 1890s, there was a notion that India must grant responsible government to India. Okay, and in the 1920s, during the First World War, we thought that yes, we need to frame our own constitution, and with the Home Rule League, right, by Annie Besant and Tilak. Then we had the Congress Muslim League scheme for constitutional reforms in the Pact of 1916, which said that we need at least 4/5 of the provincial legislatures to be elected by people on as broad a franchise as possible. Now, still, the Britishers never gave Indians the voting rights. Only 3% of people voted after 1919 and 15 after 1935. Right? So, but the idea is that in 1918, the Congress said that the principle of self-determination should be applied to all progressive nations. And this Congress claims that recognition of India as one of those progressive nations on which the principle of self-determination should be applied. The idea being that India is actually a capable progressive nation, and the people of India should be allowed to determine their own fates. Okay. Then we have the Commonwealth of India Bill. Okay, and this was by Annie Besant, Tej Bahar Sapru, and Venus Srinivas Sastry. And this was drafted in India, revised by the Labour Party leaders, and was also unanimously accepted by the Executive Committee of the Parliamentary Labour Party in the House of Commons in 1935. But obviously, Labour Party fell, and it took a lot of time before again the Labour Party came, and India could actually get. But the basic idea behind the bill was that India shall be placed on equal footing with self-governing dominions. Okay. The bill said, the memorandum said, we seek an honorable agreement, such as Britain refused to her American colonies and created a republic, but made with her other colonies and created peace and amity. The idea being that India wanted to be like Australia or Canada. We don't want basically to give up all our relationship with Britain, right? But we definitely want a dominion status. That was the idea. In 1924, Motilal Nehru, right, on 8th February in the Central Legislative Assembly, asked the government to summon at an early date a representative roundtable conference to recommend, with due regard to the protection and rights of the important minorities, a scheme of constitution for the people of India. Right? And this in time became known as a national demand. But the Britishers, and they were not ready at all to accept this national demand. And what they did, to spite Indians, they appointed an all-white Simon Commission and to recommend the constitution changes. And another thing they did was the Secretary of State, Lord Birkenhead. He said that that let first Indians produced a constitution, which basically has an agreement on the great people of India. Okay, and this was on 7th July 1925. In time, what the Congress and other parties did, they called for a all parties conference in 1928 that is, and appointed a committee chaired by Motilal Nehru, and he determined the committee. Basically he made something known as the Nehru Report, very very famous, and the Nehru Report had the right to freedom of conscience, freedom of profession, practice of religion, freedom of speech or opinion, to assemble peacefully without arms, right to form association or unions, equal rights for men and women, right to form unions, elementary education, which was very interesting that it had the right to free elementary education, right, something which we implemented as Article 21A, right, which is the 86th Amendment. Then a very interesting secular character of the state was listed as a fundamental right. So they understood the fact that it was very important to have a secular character even at that time. That's 1928 we're talking about. The redistribution of provinces should take that base on linguistic basis. This was most interesting, I would say. In the Nehru report, we have, we'll talk about this later on, that, when India became free, we had a few, reports, the Dhar committee and so on, and even the JVP committee, and in which linguistic basis of states was rejected, right? And but the reasons were different at that time. Then, in time, what happened was Nehru report, followed by a boycott of the Simon Commission, mass demonstrations, and so on. Finally, Congress declared complete independence as its goal, and mass civil disobedience movement was started. Right, lakhs went into jail, and but from that it became very, very clear that Indians would not be satisfied with anything less than to frame their own constitution. That became the idea, right? Uh, then Nehru basically, Jawaharlal Nehru said that we want a constitutional assembly, right? And that should basically decide the constitution, right? And M.N. Roy also talked about this. The Britishers bought a white paper on further constitutional reforms, but white paper, idea became that it was rejected by the Congress. Uh, and now what happened? We had the elections after 1935 Government of India Act, and in 1936-37, even after the Congress, had made, governments at various states like Bombay, Bihar, UP, Madras, central provinces, so on. Right? It basically said that the legislatures who have accepted office should articulate a demand for constituent assembly as soon as possible. Okay? And Jawaharlal Nehru told the delegates, that is the members of parliament, the legislatives, that they said that in unequivocal terms, this constitution must go. That is the Government of India Act 1935. Stock and barrel, and leave the field clear for our constituent assembly. That we need a constituent assembly. We need to make our own constitution. Okay, and the idea was demand, and this resolutions, there were resolution passed from August to October in all Congress provinces from Bombay to Northwest Frontier Province as well as Sindh, which demanded the Government of India Act 1935 be repealed and be replaced by a constitution for free India framed by the Constitutional Assembly, elected on the basis of adult franchise, that anyone above the age of 21, at that time it was 21, not 18, should be basically allowed to vote. Then S. Satyamurthy also talked about this, and he said that once a great people make up their mind to obtain the freedom, there's no power on earth, even Great Britain, who can stand in their way. Following the outbreak of the Second World War, Congress ministries resigned in protest, right? Because obviously the Britishers made India a party to the Second World War without eliciting their response or consent. India, obviously, according to the Congress legislatures and to the Congress, said that we should be regarded as an independent nation entitled to frame her own constitution. Okay, and Gandhi became even more equivocal about the Constituent Assembly. He said that democratic Swaraj lies only through a properly constituted assembly, right? And whatever name you call it, and he says that he see it is in it a remedy for a communal and a distempers, right? Besides being a vehicle for mass political and other education, he says that when all of India would come together as into a constituent assembly, it would basically make our differences go away, so that we can now discuss them. But then there were situations which have come, and then we had the August offer made by Viceroy Linlithgow to secure Indian cooperation in the war effort, right? But it said that we'll give you a dominion status, or we'll talk about a constituent assembly after the war, and this was rejected, and the Congress proceeded to start the individual Satyagraha movement, and Acharya Vinoba Bhave was the first person to offer it. And then we had other people also, but Nehru and Vallabhbhai Patel were arrested before they could offer that Satyagraha, that is. Then while in the 1942 the Britishers were actually losing during that time, and they sent a Cripps mission to India, and it talked about again that we will have a constituent assembly, right, of Indians, right? But it has proposals which were divisive, and in time, obviously, the Cripps mission was also failed, and on 8th of August, we had the famous quote by Gandhi, "Karo ya maro, do or die," and we had the Quit India movement, which had no leaders, but I think everybody became a leader in that. Okay. With that, after that, we had the war ended in May of 1945. A white paper on India was issued, followed by the abortive Shimla conference in June, July of 1945. Right, and in time they sent a cabinet mission in March of 1946. But idea began that we should have a constant making machinery, and they decided that let's have provinces like A, B, and C, in which Madras, UP, Bombay, and Central Province and Odisha will become provinces, and then and C became consisted of Muslim majority provinces of Punjab, Northwest Frontier, Sindh in the west, and Assam and Bengal in the east. So that became the cabinet mission plan. So with that, the Constituent Assembly was formed, right, and had 296 members from the British provinces elected indirectly by members of legislature, and 93 from the princely states nominated again, right? So overall, as I said, members 389 members. So 389 members were there, but in time, what happened was in that how many? Let's first discuss what was the constitution. Uh, 86 seats were reserved for Muslim and Sikh. Out of this, 78 for Muslims were won by them, right? And they won 73 seats, right? Out of the 78, and Congress only won 3 seats out of the 78, right? But out of the general seats, Congress won 199 out of the 210, right? And the total Congress tally was 208, and the Muslim League obviously had 73, which basically created a problem. The Congress wanted adult suffrage because it would make right, uh, mm, you know, the more mass-based value of Gandhi and Nehru and everyone more and more unequivocal. But it would make it was not done because it was a highly cumbersome exercise and it delayed the setting up of a constituent assembly. That was the idea behind this. It had other representatives as well. The Anglo-Indian community was represented by Frank Anthony, the Parsis by H.P. Modi, Muslims by Muhammad Sadullah, and Sikhs by the Hukum Singh, right? And but in time, when after partition, uh, it was basically reduced to 299, that is 229 plus 70, right? And the maximum was from UP, that is 55. Um, but there was now a big criticism of this, that it was basically a Congress-based Hindu caste, right, assembly. So Gandhi himself took the lead, and he suggested a name of 16 eminent persons for inclusion in the Congress list, right? So basically, they wanted to diversify the membership of the Constituent Assembly. Now, if you think about it, it was seen to be an oligarchy, right? There were old people. So Dr. Sachidanand Sinha, he became the provisional president, and invitation was issued to the name of the Secretary of the Constituent Assembly. Okay, and the Constituent Assembly started on 9 December 1946, in case of you don't know about this. Uh, Muslim League obviously refused to join, right? And on 11 December, Dr. Rajendra Prasad was elected as the permanent chairperson and was also designated as a president of the Assembly, right? And he was also the chairperson of the Rules Committee and the Steering Committee, right? I think you should write this because sometimes the objective type question comes, and who was the head of the Rules Committee and the Constituent Assembly and so on. Then we have Jawaharlal Nehru, right, who was the major leader. He was the head of the Union Power Committee, the Union Constitution Committee, and the States Committee, right? And he also moved the objectives resolution, which was debated from 13 to 19th of December, right? Its adoption was postponed to enable the representatives of the Muslim League and princely states to join. But in the next session, it was basically passed. That is from 20th to 22nd January 1947. The third session was held from 28th April to 2nd May, and the league did not join it. And on June 3rd, Mountbatten announced his plan, and it made that India was supposed to be partitioned. Now, very interestingly, after India was partitioned, what happened was the Constituent Assembly became a sovereign body. It also doubled up as the legislature for the new state. It became responsible for making the constitution as well as ordinary law. So, it had, its responsibility only increased after the partition of India. The committees, the work, there was basically a lot of work now. You have to make the Constitution of India. Even if you see the Constitution today, it has 295 articles plus in the amendments, more than 444 articles, I would say, in all. Right? There were committees on basic issues, right? We already talked about a few. There was a provincial constitutional committees by, an advisory committee, which was led by Vallabhbhai Patel, right? Fundamental rights were led by Kripalani and minorities by C. Mukherjee. Reports were submitted to B.N. Roy, the constitutional advisor. His job was to, obviously dovetail, integrate the first draft of the constitution, right? Um, the idea obviously was finally there was the third stage, the appointment of the drafting committee, and this was headed by B.R. Ambedkar, the chief architect of the constitution, and he's somehow also referred as the modern day Manu, right? Coming, I think you totally, you're trying to Sanskritize B.R. Ambedkar when you say him the modern day Manu, but he was basically something similar, right? Because the constitution can be compared to the Manu Smriti in some ways. There were the other members of the drafting committee. There was N. Gopalakwamy Iyengar, A.K. Iyer, then we have K. Munshi, then we have B.L. Mitter, right? Then we have D.P. Khaitan, who died, right? He was replaced by D.T. Krishnamacharya, right, during this. The first draft of the constitution was basically published on February 1948. And then there was a fourth stage in which the discussion and debates were there on the constitution itself. Now, what do the other people talk about the constitution, right? So, Granville Austin, right? He says the Congress Assembly Party was the unofficial private forum that debated every provision of the constitution, and in most cases decided its fates before it reached the floor of the House. Everyone elected to the Assembly of the Congress ticket could attend these meetings, whether or not he was a member of the party or even close to it. Now, basically tells you that criticism was that even before it reached the Constitutional Assembly, any debate or any article, it was already passed or rejected. Okay, there was a lot of criticism, right? The famous quote being, the Constitutional Assembly was a one-party body in essentially a one-party country. The Assembly was Congress and Congress was India. Okay, but obviously the Congress brought itself credit to itself by recruiting the best available talent and striving for consensus rather than imposing its will on through numbers. That was the idea behind it. Remember, they had actually B.R. Ambedkar, who was not a congressman. They had obviously the communist, Shyama Prakash Mukherjee, and so on, who are not part of the Congress. Now, let's look at the main provisions of the Constitution. Right, the Constitution, as we all know, was adopted, right, on in force, that is on 26 January 1950. It was implemented on 26 November 1949, right? Okay, especially on exigencies, which is part 2 of the Constitution, that is citizenship. They wanted actually, because the partition of India had created some exigencies also. Now, let's look at the Constitution of India and its main provisions. Now, if you don't know about the Constitution of India, just to give you a brief idea, Part 1 of the Constitution talks about the Union and its territory. Article 1 to 4 and talks about what is Bharat, right, and whether it's divisible or it's not divisible, so on. We'll talk about that in much more detail. It also talks about how can I divide a state, right? Then we have Part 2, that is Article 5 to 12, that is about citizenship. And then we have Part 3, which is very important, Article 13 to 35, that is the fundamental rights. Okay, so the idea is that the Constitution basically lays down a set of rules to which the ordinary laws of country must conform. It provides a basic framework, right? Whether democratic or parliamentary, what form of government will we have, right? Whether we have a presidential form of government, what it does it. It includes a list of fundamental rights and directive principles. Now, what is fundamental rights? It's a guarantee against encroachments by the state, and directive principles are a set of directives to the state to introduce reforms to make those rights effective. So remember, it is not fundamental rights against DPSPs. It is DPSPs which, if they are actually implemented in letter and spirit, they would actually allow fundamental rights to become effective. And that is, some people don't understand this. They normally have this, there's always has been a debate after the Constitution, right? Then there was also, the idea to give, India a parliamentary system was not taken without serious debate. There was an alternative, the Gandhian alternative, that is panchayat-based indirect elections and decentralized government. But it did not have widespread support, okay, because of the fact that we had partition at that time. Then the question was that whether we should have socialism. Now the next question we normally have is whether we should have socialism in Indian Constitution. Uh, the intellectual and emotional commitment of many members of socialism, right, allowed that yes, we should have socialism. But most members desired the socialism should not be embodied in constitution, right? That democratic constitution with a socialist framework should be framed. That you'll find a lot of DPSPs are socialist in nature, especially Article 39, to be framed to allow the nation to become socialist as and when it wanted to be. Whether the citizens desired it to become, though basically they actually are trying to give too much credit to the citizens of India maybe. Then we have the next question, whether we should have adult suffrage. Now the Congress had demanded adult suffrage since the 1920s. It was difficult now because now the opportunity had come. Now a few voices advocated confining of adult suffrage to panchayat elections at the village level and then indirect elections to the higher bodies. But there was an overwhelming consensus that we should have direct elections by adult suffrage, which was obviously not a small achievement in a country like India and during that time, in a Brahminical, upper caste dominated, male oriented, elitist, largely illiterate and society that we had. Okay. Alaidi Krishnaswamy here, right? He said that the assembly had adopted the principle of adult franchise with abundant faith in the common man and the ultimate success of democratic rule. Though only alternative to adult suffrage was some kind of indirect election based upon village, community, or local bodies. And this was not found feasible because it will become too difficult to implement in a country like India so soon. Okay. Now, what Austin talks about, direct election by adult suffrage, the gong, the single note, whose reverberations might awaken or at least still sleeping India. K.M. Panikkar talks about adult suffrage. He says that adult suffrage has social implications far beyond its political significance. Now, many social groups, previously unaware of their strength, barely touched by the political changes that had taken place, suddenly realized that they were in a position to wield power. And when you read books by Rajni Kothari, right, on caste and politics or politics in India, you realize that there were so many social groups who have now become aware: the Yadavs, the Jats, the Reddys, and so on, right? You'll find such groups in every area, and this only happened because of their numbers and strength. The beauty of adult suffrage is that it forces the most elitist of candidates to seek the favor of the vote of the humblest voter. Okay, so it basically is a spiritual enlightenment for the elitist people in India. Initially, the British rule, the franchise was restricted by property, by educational qualifications to only 15% of the country's population. That went away with. Then we have something known as the Preamble, and it is the basic philosophy of the Constitution. It's the moving spirit of the right, and there's a question in UPSC which has come. It says the Preamble to the Constitution is a key to the minds of the makers of the Constitution, right? And Nehru's objective resolution, which was drafted, is seen to be the preamble. It talked about justice, social, economic, and political. It talks about liberty of thought, of expression, of belief, of faith, and of worship. Right? Please try to, when you talk about that, and equality of status of an opportunity, right? Fraternity, ensuring the dignity of the individual and the unity of the nation. The most interesting was that priority has been given to the concept of justice as compared to liberty, equality, fraternity, right? And the idea being that social and economic justice, that social and political justice is given priority over other areas. So the order of the words suggests that social justice and economic justice was considered perhaps the first fundamental norm of Indian Constitution of India. Okay, right? And then we have the FR and the DPSPs, which are seen to be the conscience of the Constitution. Okay. Normally, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights contains two sets of rights. We have the traditional human rights, political rights, and the new economic and social rights. Now, the first two, civil and political rights, are considered under the fundamental rights, and the other social and economic rights are put on DPSPs. Right? And the distinction is very simple. That why? Because the state could straight away guarantee political and civil rights. It could only ensure economic and social justice over a period of time as the economy is developed and social change has taken place. Right? The idea being that obviously for a fundamental rights violation you can go to court, and we have Article 32 for that, but we don't have, DPSPs, typically are not justiciable. But the idea being that DPSP could become justiciable as they were incorporated into laws, and you basically will have acts of parliament. Okay, then we had, the next question is, why do, we have a written law despite the fact that Britishers don't? Okay, so the answer is the decision to have written laws, a list of rights, a declaration of rights in the constitution is a marked sharp break with the British constitutional tradition. The Britishers, during the period of independence movement, had consistently rejected Indian demands for a list of rights. Indians, on the other hand, because of their colonial experience, had developed a healthy suspicion of government and preferred rights to be written down. Okay, and obviously this was preference was in keeping with the international trends as well. Following separation of human rights in Germany, Soviet Union, right, the Atlantic Charter and the United States Charter had been drawn up already, and the United Nations Human Rights Commission had been established. So obviously it was now logical to have a written law. Okay. Then obviously the fundamental inclusion of human rights in the Constitution of India Bill framed in 1895, and then obviously prominently in the Motilal Nehru report of 1928, had made sure that this was a very good idea. Further, obviously, it was a very convenient way of setting at rest the fears of minorities. Now we can always tell them that we have given you cultural rights, we have given you religious rights. There is equality of employment in India, equality of before law, and we have mentioned that it will not actually impact you. Okay, so now Patel basically talks about this. Patel says it is for us to prove that it is a bogus claim, a false claim, that the Britishers, if they stayed on India, they'd stayed just to protect the minorities, okay, which would be suppressed by majority. He says that nobody can be more interested in us in the protection of minorities. Our mission is to satisfy every one of them. That was the idea. Then we have the next question. Normally we have this question that Indian constitution is a bag of borrowed material. Okay, and we have a lot of borrowed material, I would be honest. The first one is the DPSPs themselves, and they were basically borrowed from the Irish constitution, right? We have fundamental rights and judicial review borrowed from USA. We have parliamentary privileges, single citizenship, rule of law, writs by the Supreme Court, again from the UK. We have the process of removal of High Court and Supreme Court justice, the post of the Vice President, the independence of judiciary, the impeachment process of the president, due process of law. We all took all of them from the United States. We have resolutory power belonging to the center from Canada, the federal state with a strong center again from Canada, appointment of governor by the center again from Canada, advisory jurisdiction of the apex court Canada, procedure established by law from Japan, right? Then we have from Ireland, as I talked about the DPSPs. We have the election of the president we have taken from the Irish. We have taken the president sending messages to the parliament again from the Irish. We have nomination of the members of Rajya Sabha again from the Irish, and so on. Then we have fundamental duties and idea of socialism from USSR. We have amendments and procedure to elect Rajya Sabha members from South Africa. We have the notion of republic, that the head of state is elected and sovereignty lies with the people and public offices are open to all from France. We have from Australia the idea of the current concurrent list. We have the joint sitting again from Australia. We have freedom of trade and commerce throughout the country again from Australia. Then we have the emergency provisions from the Weimar Constitution of Germany. So all of this, right? Please, if you have time, right, pause it again and revise it again, because this is something that again can come in objective type questions. I might put a few right during the end of this video. Okay, so as I said, that obviously two kinds of, obviously there was also another way of doing the DPSP and AFR. There was a possibility of creating two kinds of rights, that is justiciable and non-justiciable, as mentioned by the sub report. right? Then if we go into the fundamental rights, we have 7 parts. If you go into detail, that I think fundamental rights is somehow the cornerstone or the conscience of uh, the Constitution. Fundamental rights are divided into 7 parts: right to equality, right to freedom, right against exploitation, rights to freedom of religious cultural rights, the right to property, and the right to constitutional remedies. And these rights are incorporated in Article 12 to 35, as I mentioned before. Then we have articles against untouchability. We have Article 15.2, which says that no citizen shall suffer any disability in use of shops, restaurants, wells, and roads and other public places on the account of his religion, race, caste, sex, or place. We have Article 23, which prohibits forced labor, though it was basically extracted by the colonial state and the princely states. And it was a common characteristic of exploitation by big and semi-feudal lords, especially landlords. We have writs such as habeas corpus, mandamus, prohibition, quo warranto, and certiorari. Okay. There was always a debate between DPSP and the fundamental rights. It was generally agreed that in 1971 till 1971, fundamental rights were given more importance than DPSP. But with the 25th and 42nd Amendments in 1971-76, Indira Gandhi government gave precedence to the DPSPs. Again, in 1980, we had a landmark judgment by Minerva Mills Limited versus Union of India that the Supreme Court held that both fundamental rights and DPSPs are equally important and one cannot be sacrificed over the other. The idea being that they're just, DPSPs are fundamental rights in the making. So you basically, instead of arguing one over the other, you basically should appreciate both of them. Uh, the essence of DPSP, if you think about what is a DPSP, it is that the state shall strive to promote the welfare of the people by securing and protecting as effectively as it may a social order where justice, social, economic, and political shall inform all institutions of life. The idea being that all citizens should have adequate means of livelihood. There should be equitable distribution of material resources. That concentration of wealth and production means of production should be avoided. That there should be equal pay for equal work. The health of workers, pregnant women, children should be protected. The workers should get a living wage and just and human conditions of work, right? So the idea being that we should have right to work, we should have right to education, right to public assistance in case of unemployment, old age, and sickness. And idea being DPSPs also express the hopes that within 10 years we should have compulsory primary education of children up to 14 years. But it took us, I think, more than 50 to do that. The objective of common civil code was also desired, but obviously it's still to be achieved. Right. Again, a common civil code, it was basically just to assuage the Hindu communists who were inside the Hindu Mansabha, who were also members of the Constituent Assembly. This obviously the idea was also to organize the panchayats, Article 40 of the Constitution, and this was basically given form in the 73rd and 74th Amendment. The idea being to improve the living nutrition, and we have so many schemes for that, to provide free legal aid, and this being an amendment in Article 39A, to promote educational and interest of scheduled tribes, scheduled castes, and other weaker sections, and we have so many scholarships for them because of that. Though, very interestingly, they don't know about those scholarships themselves. Was to protect and improve the environment, and basically there was an article as Article 48A, to safeguard the forests and wildlife of the country. All these basically, with Article 50, that is separation of powers between the judiciary and the executive and legislature, international peace should be maintained, and so on. So, DPSPs basically are even more interesting. They represent a dynamic move towards a certain objective. Okay. Fundamental rights is something static. That's what Nehru says. Right? Both are right again. Right? The process of dynamic movements, certain existing relationships are altered, varied, and effective. In fact, they're meant to affect those settled relationship. And yet, if you come back to the fundamental rights, they're meant to preserve, not indirectly, certain settled relation. And therefore, there is certain conflict between the two. Right? Okay. The idea is that there's one dynamic DPSP we want to grow. On the other hand, fundamental rights is like the status quo. So obviously there has to be some kind of a fight between them. That was the idea. And obviously there were conflicts, and there were the basic conflicts in 1950s itself. We have the zamindari and jagidari people. They basically, basically blocked legislation on the abolition of landlords zamindari system on the basis of right to property. And the property provisions obviously turned out to be the most controversial. The First Amendment, asserted, Article 31A and 31B into the Ninth Schedule, thus securing the constitutional validation of zamindari or abolition laws by other things that they could not be challenged on the grounds they, violated fundamental rights. Okay. And then obviously there were also the First Amendment also made some changes in Article 15, 19, and 31, which talked about fundamental rights of equality, freedom of expression, and of property. Then further, amendments had to be made in 1955 in Article 31 and 31A to make the quantum of compensation to be paid for acquired property non-justiciable, as well as other things. So, it was basically a continuous evolution of the Constitution, and we'll talk about these amendments later on. The next question, obviously, is whether India should be a secular state. The Constitution declared India to be a sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic republic. Now, remember these terms, secular and socialist, were added only in this 42nd Amendment in 1956. But the spirit that India is secular was already there. Now, there's always this question, and this question has come, and why, how is Western context of secularism different from us? And the answer is here in this book itself, right? And this came in this year's paper itself, so you can go through this question as well. So what it says, some people have argued that the Western context from which the term secular is borrowed is very different one. In the West, the outcome of the struggle between the church and the state led to the separation between the two. The church was allowed to decide on rituals, that is religious, and the states were allowed to regulate secular affairs. Now, in India, it's very different. In India, the concept of secularism was evolved as a part of the struggle of the nationalist forces against the communists who wanted to use religion for political purposes and divide the nation on the basis of religion. Nehru puts this best. What does Nehru say? Nehru say, we call our state a secular one. The word secular perhaps is not a very happy one, and yet for want of a better, we have used it. What does that mean? It does not obviously mean a society where religion itself is discouraged. It means freedom of religion and conscience, including freedom for those who may not have no religion. It means free play for all religions, subject only to their not interfering with each other with the basic conceptions of our state. The idea is that you will not tell me to go to Pakistan if I have a certain religion. You will not tell me to do this, and right? You have no idea, you have no right to basically interfere with the basic conceptions of our state. Okay, my citizenship is not subject to what you think. That was the basic idea, that no religion should be basically made a scapegoat for any kind of go to Pakistan. That is the idea. Now, S. Radhakrishnan, he was a renowned scholar and also the president of India from 62 to 67. He said that secularism is a part of Indian tradition. He says secularism was a part of Indian tradition. He says we hold that no religion should be given a preferential status of unique distinction. No group of people shall arrogate to itself rights and privileges that it denies to others. No person should suffer any form of disability or discrimination because of his religion, but all alike should be free to share the fullest degree in common life. Secularism, as here defined, is in accordance with the ancient religious tradition of it. Okay, so that is the idea. And if you in the previous video we talked about secularism, and we talked about what Gandhi talked about secularism as well. Go through that as well, right? Okay. With that, we end this chapter. Right. Thank you so much for watching. Right. If you have any questions, do comment. Right. And we will be doing the Constitution in much more detail in another series. So I've actually skipped a lot. Right. Thank you so much. If you have any questions regarding any part of the Constitution, anything, right, you can actually comment. Right. Thank you so much.